After they had finished battling the monster, a calm and quiet atmosphere settled in the surroundings. Yushin and Choi Siwoo are feeling confused because they can't understand how they managed to spot one another, especially given the presence of a monstrous creature in the vicinity. Yushin couldn't help but feel really puzzled by the fact that Choi Siwoo was suddenly right in front of him. He took a few steps closer, wanting to examine the changes that had taken place while Choi Siwoo was away for a little while. Moving closer, Yushin gently held Jongyu with a touch of worry evident in his expression. He asked about what had happened and was surprised when he looked at Jongyu's altered appearance. However, Yushin quickly suggested to Jongyu that they should put that matter aside and instead shift the conversation towards how Jongyu managed to handle the monstrous creature. Choi Siwoo requests Yushin to hold on for a moment, expressing his need to explain the situation, but his ability to breathe suddenly becomes difficult, causing him distress. Observing Choi Siwoo closely, Yushin's mind raced as he considered the possibility that Choi Siwoo might be affected by a unique form of poisoning rather than an ordinary one. Yushin speculated that even with his emergency medicine, he might not have the means to effectively treat Choi Siwoo's condition. Upon careful observation, Yushin detected a distinct change in Choi Siwoo's physical condition. Yushin was taken aback by the realization that Choi Siwoo's body was actually in the process of healing itself. They both paused for a moment, allowing Choi Siwoo's body to naturally counteract the effects of the poison. While they were in the midst of their momentary pause, Yushin's attention was suddenly drawn to the fact that the monstrous creature was attempting to escape from their vicinity. Yushin's gaze fell upon the trail of the serpent-like monster's blood, clearly visible as it marked the creature's slow retreat in its attempt to distance itself from them. Amidst Yushin's distraction due to his reunion with Choi Siwoo, the tail of the monster became visible as it made a gradual effort to distance itself. Seizing the opportunity, the monster seemed to believe that retreating was a favorable course of action. Yushin and Choi Siwoo both watched as the monster managed to escape, and Yushin couldn't help but feel that the situation was becoming even more chaotic and insane. After some time, they decided to step outside to take a deep breath of fresh air. Once outside, Choi Siwoo turned to Yushin and asked if he was all right. Yushin felt a bit puzzled, unsure if Choi Siwoo was inquiring about his own well-being or Yushin's. He responded, saying that he believed he was indeed okay. Upon seeing Yushin's perplexed expression, Choi Siwoo simply smiled. It was quite a surprise for Yushin to discover that his friend of 3 years was, in fact, a supernatural hybrid. Even more astonishing was the revelation that Choi Siwoo belonged to the category of a goblin hybrid. Yushin felt a surge of frustration welling up within him. He couldn't believe that for 3 whole years, Choi Siwoo's true nature as a goblin had remained completely hidden from his senses. Yushin even went so far as to criticize the Minister of National Defense for aspiring to become the Moon King over a subject they didn't suspect. As Yushin contemplated the situation, he couldn't help but imagine how his father would react if he found out that Yushin had been oblivious to Choi Siwoo's goblin identity. He felt entirely clueless and anticipated that his father might even find humor in the situation. After hearing Yushin's frustrations, Choi Siwoo tells Yushin about his house and how he never mentioned what kind of training center it was. Yushin decided to come clean about the training center's purpose. He confided in Choi Siwoo that his family had a duty to eliminate supernatural creatures, and if he chose not to undergo training, he would likely be regarded as an outcast or even considered somewhat deranged within their family circles. Being part of that family, Choi Siwoo began to reflect on the idea that Yushin might have been aware of the upcoming ancestral ceremony scheduled to take place in 6 months. Curious about the matter, Choi Siwoo inquired if such ancestral ceremonies were a regular thing. Yushin admitted that he couldn't exactly label the ancestral ceremony as common, indicating that it was actually quite rare. He went on to explain his perspective, mentioning that while he might not be overly concerned if supernatural monsters were battling each other, the situation took a more serious turn when those same creatures started posing a threat to humans. Yushin proceeded to explain that there had been a shift in the events and circumstances surrounding the story. Evidently intrigued by Yushin's words, Choi Siwoo's curiosity appeared to intensify, indicating a growing eagerness on his part to know further into the details of these recent changes. Yushin proceeded to share with Choi Siwoo a crucial piece of information. Among the yakais, humans were considered the ultimate source of power. Yushin highlighted that some yakai, those aspiring to achieve a higher status like becoming a king, had overstepped a boundary. These particular yakai had shifted from merely consuming virtues to a more sinister act. They were now not only consuming the virtues of humans, but also actively preying upon and devouring humans themselves. Yushin continued his explanation to Choi Siwoo by sharing alarming news. Over the past month, there had been a noticeable rise in the cases of missing individuals, particularly in densely populated cities. While there wasn't concrete evidence directly associating these incidents with the yokai, what stood out was the aftermath at the homes of the disappeared individuals. In most instances, there were indications of violence and chaos, with signs of bloodshed and widespread destruction left in the wake of the disappearance. As Yushin spoke to Choi Siwoo about the unusual behavior of the yokai, noting that this was the first time they had made themselves so openly apparent, he suddenly became aware that someone was about to approach them. Yushin swiftly rose to his feet, his actions driven by a sense of urgency to protect both himself and Choi Siwoo. All of a sudden, without any warning, a dazzling and radiant light emerged right before their very eyes, illuminating the space directly in front of Yushin and Choi Siwoo. Choi Siwoo found himself taken aback by the sudden appearance of Sol Mai. Upon reaching Choi Siwoo's location, Sol Mai showed genuine concern. She promptly inquired about Choi Siwoo's well-being, asking if he was all right. Furthermore, she expressed regret, offering an apology for being absent for an extended period of time. Yushin swiftly reacted by directing his sword towards Sol Mai and firmly voiced his discontent, instructing her to cease her nonsense, or confusing talk. Seeing Sol Mai's confusion and emotional state, which seemed to be a result of her concern for Choi Siwoo, Yushin's own worry translated into a defensive action. He raised his sword, aiming it in Sol Mai's direction, and sternly warned her not to approach any closer. Yushin positioned the sword pointedly towards Sol Mai, eagerly warning her. He expressed his strong warning, stating that if she were to disregard his caution and venture even a single step closer, he would view it as a direct ignorance of the warning, leading him to take swift and decisive action to eliminate her without hesitation. Just as Choi Siwoo was on the verge of revealing information about Sol Mai, Yushin's heightened defensive stance took precedence. His thoughts were consumed by his protective instincts, leading him to entertain the idea that Sol Mai might not actually be a human, but potentially a yokai. Yushin conveyed to Choi Siwoo his belief that Sol Mai likely possessed an understanding of the principle of the rules and regulations. He explained that his decision to issue a warning rather than resorting to immediate elimination was influenced by the notion that Sol Mai might comprehend the significance of abiding by the law. Yushin shared with Choi Siwoo his perspective that when dealing with yokai, providing a warning might not be necessary if they were already inclined to attack them regardless. Observing Yushin's intense defensive stance and his determination to safeguard them, Choi Siwoo cast a worried glance at Sol Mai. In that moment, Yushin couldn't help but entertain the notion that Sol Mai might indeed be a dangerous and formidable monster. Sol Mai locked eyes with Yushin while he explained that she was, in fact, a monster. Yushin's words resonated with her as he says that despite any human-like appearance, the fundamental nature of monsters remained unchanged. This nature led them to be consumed by their own power, leading to violence against humans. Yushin added that this violence even extended to their own leaders, showing that monsters could turn against their own king. While keeping his sword aimed at Sol Mai, Yushin spoke to Choi Siwoo. He emphasized that despite having goblin lineage in his blood, Choi Siwoo was fundamentally a human. He asserted that the human world was his rightful home, and he didn't require the approval of monsters to exist within it. Struggling to come to terms with Choi Siwoo's situation, Yushin expressed his disbelief. He made it clear that regardless of the circumstances, he couldn't fathom letting Choi Siwoo go away. While Yushin shared his thoughts, Sol Mai started to think. She thought that Choi Siwoo might be seeing the situation as a strange and senseless disaster. Sol Mai contemplated the situation and arrived at a similar conclusion. She realized that despite the current circumstances, Choi Siwoo's status was already established within the supernatural records. His perspective or position aside, he unmistakably belonged to the realm of supernatural beings. Sol Mai considered the situation from a broader perspective. She believed that overlooking the concepts of right and wrong, such a breach of established rules could lead to severe consequences, not only for Choi Siwoo but also for his friend Yushin. Sol Mai's thoughts turned towards finding a solution to the dilemma. She pondered a plan for escaping with Siwoo, realizing the urgency of resolving the situation before it had a chance to escalate any further. As she prepared herself for a potential fight, Sol Mai couldn't help but assess the situation. She believed that Yushin was a formidable individual but doubted his ability to handle a conflict with Choi Siwoo. Sol Mai's determination to escape with Choi Siwoo overrode her concerns. She recognized that she had no alternative but to confront Yushin. With resolve, she conveyed to Yushin that, in her capacity as Choi Siwoo's guardian, she was obliged to take him along with her. Yushin responded firmly, indicating to Sol Mai that if she persisted in disregarding his warning, he would be left with no choice but to eliminate her. Convinced that Sol Mai had chosen to overlook his warning, Yushin made up his mind to proceed with his plan to eliminate her. As Yushin was preparing to take action, Choi Siwoo unexpectedly stepped forward to confront him. Out of nowhere, Choi Siwoo abruptly seized the sword from Yushin's grasp. Yushin found himself taken aback by Choi Siwoo's unexpected and swift action. With Yushin's sword in his possession, Choi Siwoo examined it closely. He couldn't help but find the sword's design intriguing and started to contemplate the meaning behind the engraved symbols on it. Yushin contemplated the notion that Choi Siwoo might be under the influence of some form of magic or manipulation. However, he also noticed a distinct change in Choi Siwoo's demeanor, sensing a different energy or vibe surrounding him. Choi Siwoo proceeded to share his thoughts with Yushin. He acknowledged that the concept of the killings might be difficult for him to comprehend. However, he suggested that the notion of a yokai consuming its own king due to madness seemed to resemble Yushin. Yushin was taken aback by Choi Siwoo's revelation that he had actually consumed another being. Choi Siwoo stated in explanation, defending his actions by stating that he had taken another's life in order to safeguard himself and those in his vicinity. Sol Mai attentively listened as Choi Siwoo outlined his intentions to continue as a goblin. He assured Yushin that his intention was not to harm humans or cause damage. However, he acknowledged his readiness to consume non-essential yokai if it served the purpose of strengthening himself or avoiding death. Yushin then convinced Choi Siwoo that he doesn't need to go that far as to make himself a resident of the supernatural realm and devour monsters. Yushin reassured Choi Siwoo by explaining that, whether within his own family or independently, he possessed the strength to shield Choi Siwoo and his mother. Yushin believed that they would be well protected and secure in the human world. With Yushin's sword now lowered, Choi Siwoo conveyed that he had an additional point to address, building on the earlier conversation. To Yushin's surprise, and with a smile, Choi Siwoo declared his intention that he was going to become the Yokai King. Yushin was taken aback by Choi Siwoo's unexpected proclamation, causing him to pause momentarily, processing this surprising declaration. Even Sol Mai was caught off guard by Choi Siwoo's abrupt announcement of his desire to become the Yokai King. Yushin expressed his frustrations, questioning whether Choi Siwoo might be considered somewhat irrational for aspiring to be a Yokai King. He asked Choi Siwoo if he truly comprehends the implications of his statement. Choi Siwoo responded, admitting that he might not have an extensive explanation at the moment, but he remained steady in his determination. Choi Siwoo explained to Yushin that he felt compelled to give it a try. He believed that if he were to become the Yokai King, it wouldn't necessarily result in the world turning upside down. Yushin was left speechless and found himself at a loss for words. He stared at Choi Siwoo with a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. Choi Siwoo conveyed to Yushin that he felt helpless in the current situation. He believed that taking some sort of action was better than remaining inactive. He mused that this course of action seemed to be a good fit for him. Yushin was rendered speechless and took a moment to gather his thoughts. While contemplating Choi Siwoo's words, Yushin came to a decision. Yushin conveyed his understanding to Choi Siwoo. He explained that regardless of whether Choi Siwoo was human or a supernatural being, clear intentions were what mattered. Yushin believed that there was no need to impose anything forcefully on Choi Siwoo if his intentions were sincere. Yushin added a statement, stating that if Choi Siwoo were to overstep certain boundaries as a supernatural being, he would not hesitate to eliminate him immediately. Choi Siwoo concurred with Yushin's words, acknowledging that he was correct in his assessment. As a mutual understanding settled between them, Yushin retrieved his mask. Yushin, taking a step forward, inquired about Sol Mai's name. She introduced herself and revealed that she held the significant role of a promising messenger within the half-Yokai court. Yushin extended an apology to Sol Mai for intervening in Yokai affairs. Yushin acknowledged the presence of laws within the Yokai world and their right to enforce them. He emphasized to Sol Mai that if she couldn't ensure fairness, and an absence of unjust harm, he would step in to intervene should anyone be unfairly killed or injured. Yushin further elaborated that in his capacity as the chief shaman of the Star Hall, he held a position of authority. He stated that if any incidents occurred involving them, he would take decisive action and eliminate those responsible without showing any mercy. Yushin said his farewell to Choi Siwoo, reassuring him not to be concerned about his mother's well-being. Choi Siwoo watched Yushin as he walked away from them, his gaze fixed on his departing figure. Feeling a wave of relief, Sol Mai's emotions nearly overwhelmed her. She felt on the verge of tears, realizing that she had been genuinely frightened. This encounter with a shaman was her first, and the experience had been both intimidating and overwhelming for her. Abruptly, a man's voice broke the silence, intervening in their conversation. The man stated that Yushin was indeed an extraordinary exception. Sol Mai shifted her gaze towards the source of the voice and saw Goyu, who had followed her. Goyu explained that he had chosen to follow Sol Mai's lead. He expressed that he had considered her actions, noting that despite her lack of knowledge about the opponent's strength and numbers, she had charged into the situation without hesitation. As Goyu's words sank in, Sol Mai's expression turned somber. She seemed to feel a sense of sadness as he pointed out that even if the opponent had been slightly stronger, she might have been overpowered and devoured without having a chance to defend herself. Shifting his focus, Goyu directed his attention towards Choi Siwoo. He inquired if Choi Siwoo was the goblin known for his recklessness. In response, Choi Siwoo greeted him. Goyu's thoughts seemed to drift as he contemplated the situation. He remarked that creatures with a foundation in animals were referred to as beast demons. In many instances, these creatures were constrained by their physical form and primal instincts, resembling ancestral beings. As these beings evolved into yokai, their status underwent a transformation. Not only did their human facade change, but their true forms also diverged from their original nature. Yokai or groups of yokai with such characteristics are commonly known as phantom beasts. While Goyu was in the process of introducing himself, Choi Siwoo appeared to be taken aback by the revelation. Suddenly, the presence of a large yokai monster's aura materialized before Choi Siwoo, positioning itself directly in front of him. Goyu introduced himself to Choi Siwoo, sharing his name, and extended a greeting, expressing that it was a pleasure to meet him. Goyu held the role of a representative within the Goyu Black Turquoise clan. As a symbol of greeting and challenge, Goyu extended his hand towards Choi Siwoo. He explained that in order to become a yokai king, Choi Siwoo would need to overcome him in combat. With a friendly demeanor, Goyu stretched out his hand towards Choi Siwoo and offered his greetings, accompanied by a warm smile. Choi Siwoo responded by extending his hand to meet Goyu's gesture, but he couldn't help but notice a change in Goyu's demeanor. He sensed that Goyu's vibe had shifted from what it was just a moment ago. In the midst of Choi Siwoo's intention to reciprocate Goyu's hand gesture with a handshake, Sol Mai's voice erupted with urgency. She swiftly raised her voice, offering a cautionary shout to Choi Siwoo, advising him against proceeding to clasp Goyu's hand. Surprised by the sudden warning, Choi Siwoo turned his gaze towards Sol Mai, seeking an explanation for her unexpected outburst. Sol Mai's anger flared as she directed her frustration towards Goyu. She raised her voice, demanding to know the reason for his sudden appearance and expressing her displeasure. She pointed out that Choi Siwoo had already faced a challenging day, questioning why Goyu chose this moment to show up. Goyu responded defiantly, asking Sol Mai what the problem was. He asserted that there were no rules dictating that he had to remain asleep all the time. Without warning, Goyu forcibly seized Choi Siwoo's hand. He commented to Choi Siwoo that he found it amusing to witness a half-goblin boasting about the ambition to become the yokai king. Goyu unleashed his power, showcasing his ability by biting his nails and unleashing his master art's mastery. A violet and dark circle formed, enveloping both Goyu and Choi Siwoo. Goyu maintained his grip on his hands, while the mysterious circle encircled them. Unexpectedly, Goyu swiftly employed a teleportation technique, resulting in an immediate shift that rendered them vanished from their prior position. The abrupt vanishing act left Sol Mai in a state of surprise and uncertainty, as she grappled with the sudden turn of events and found herself unsure of the appropriate course of action to take next. As Choi Siwoo and Goyu completed their teleportation, the surroundings underwent a dramatic transformation. They now found themselves in a new setting, marked by the presence of a full moon casting its radiant glow upon a serene lake. Choi Siwoo and Goyu successfully arrived at their intended destination, and they were on the brink of making their landing. Upon their teleportation to a different location, Choi Siwoo found himself grappling with the experience. As they touched down, he struggled to maintain his balance, his body reacting to the unfamiliar sensation of teleportation, which had been both sudden and devoid of any prior warning. Goyu acknowledged that the process had been more challenging than anticipated, particularly for Choi Siwoo on his first attempt at teleportation. He expressed his admiration for Choi Siwoo's ability to remain on his feet, noting that not many individuals could manage to stand on two legs after their initial experience with teleportation. As Goyu observed Choi Siwoo, he discerned that Choi Siwoo didn't display the level of surprise one might expect from a sudden teleportation. Instead, Choi Siwoo regarded him with an aura of alarm and suspicion. In response, Choi Siwoo posed a question, asking if Goyu had intentionally planned to seize him from the outset. Goyu responded by acknowledging that the scenario Choi Siwoo proposed was indeed the most probable outcome. However, before proceeding, he expressed his desire to ask Choi Siwoo something. Choi Siwoo was caught off guard by the abruptness of Goyu's query, which revolved around his engagement with computer games. The question seemed to arrive out of nowhere, surprising Choi Siwoo and prompting him to momentarily process the unexpected topic of conversation. Choi Siwoo responded to Goyu's question, explaining that during his middle school years, he had experimented with a variety of activities, including computer games. However, as he transitioned to high school, his engagement with gaming diminished significantly. In response, Goyu inquired further, asking Choi Siwoo about the specific genres of games he used to play. Given the choice, Choi Siwoo indicated that he would opt for action games. Despite not actively playing games, he shared his perspective that in contemporary times, investing time takes precedence over honing skill, making the act of spending time on a particular activity more important. Goyu's smile took on a somewhat mischievous smile as he responded to Choi Siwoo's perspective. He remarked that Choi Siwoo's point was indeed valid, implying an agreement with his sentiment. Choi Siwoo's state of alarm increased as he realized that Goyu had initiated a sudden movement, seemingly with the intention of launching an attack from behind him. Initiating an assault from his current position, Goyu launched an attack against Choi Siwoo. Reacting to the sudden assault with a mix of alarm and instinct, Choi Siwoo swiftly sidestepped and maneuvered his body adeptly, managing to dodge the incoming attack launched by Goyu. His quick reflexes and agile movement allowed him to evade the danger effectively, ensuring that he emerged from the situation unharmed and without sustaining any injuries. Abruptly, Choi Siwoo's attention was drawn to a sudden occurrence that is an ice crystal materialized on the surface of the lake. Caught off guard by the unexpected ice formation, Choi Siwoo found himself in a state of surprise and uncertainty. Faced with the situation, he grappled with determining his next course of action, considering strategies to effectively evade the oncoming barrage of crystals. Numerous crystals materialized seemingly out of thin air, a phenomenon that was likely orchestrated by Goyu. These crystals emerged with the intent to attack Choi Siwoo. Goyu observed with keen attention as Choi Siwoo adeptly evaded each of the incoming crystals, his movements demonstrating impressive agility and swiftness. As Choi Siwoo prepared to launch a charge towards him, Goyu shifted his gaze upwards. He recognized Choi Siwoo's impressive speed and agility, acknowledging that Choi Siwoo had managed to target him before he could react with evasive maneuvers. Goyu's gaze remained fixed on Choi Siwoo. He pondered the possibility that Choi Siwoo might have been the one to initiate the attack, leading to Choi Siwoo independently arriving at the decision to direct his assault towards him. Goyu's abilities were subtly on display as he continued to contemplate the situation. He marveled at Choi Siwoo's remarkable performance, acknowledging that despite being relatively new to these circumstances, Choi Siwoo had managed to showcase a level of skill that was undeniably impressive. Observing the ongoing combat, Goyu noted that Choi Siwoo's senses and innate combat abilities were exceptionally strong. However, what stood out even more prominently in this instance was Choi Siwoo's remarkable capacity for learning. It was this ability to quickly adapt and absorb new information that shone brightest in the current situation. Recalling a scenario where an adversary had guided the approach Choi Siwoo had encountered that day, Goyu found himself reminiscing about a similar situation. As Goyu observes Choi Siwoo, he thought he was remaining vigilant against the potential dangers that the adversary might possess. Choi Siwoo maintained a cautious stance, prepared to counter any potential threats. Choi Siwoo concentrated his power, channeling it into his fist as he prepared himself for an impending attack against Goyu. Harnessing his inner strength and focusing it into his fist, Choi Siwoo released a formidable burst of power aimed directly at Goyu. Employing the power of the Goblin's treasure armor, Choi Siwoo utilized an ear cuff that harnessed the wearer's energy and strength. This enabled him to unleash a surge of formidable power, resulting in a potent burst of energy. After landing, Choi Siwoo's attack caused the surroundings to be enveloped in an increasing veil of smoke. He focused his unleashed power towards Goyu, directing it with intention and determination. Despite launching an attack against Goyu, Choi Siwoo maintained a defensive stance, remaining vigilant and ready to react to any potential counterattacks or incoming threats. While it might appear that Choi Siwoo's attack had struck its target, he remained cautious and vigilant, never lowering his guard and maintaining his readiness to respond to any potential developments. Amidst the enveloping smoke, an unusual light began to show, capturing Choi Siwoo's attention. He continued to maintain a defensive posture, his gaze fixed on the source of the strange light with unwavering caution. In the midst of his attack against Goyu, Choi Siwoo experienced a realization concerning the concept of life force. This understanding led him to believe that he had gained a deeper insight into the situation. Choi Siwoo sensed a vivid surge of electrical energy coursing through his body, with the sensation originating from his lower extremity. Choi Siwoo recognized that the attack he had unleashed represented only a fraction of his true power, approximately 10%. However, as Choi Siwoo continued to release multiple smaller attacks, he perceived that each of these attacks seemed to deplete his energy at a rate of approximately 3% per strike. Contemplating the implications of his energy levels potentially dropping to 0%, Choi Siwoo couldn't help but consider the possibility of entering a state of depletion, similar to what had occurred previously. This realization led him to acknowledge that he couldn't continuously employ his powers without limitation. As the full moon continued its ascent, Goyu directed a compliment towards Choi Siwoo, acknowledging his efforts and actions in the ongoing situation. Wearing a smile, Goyu addressed Choi Siwoo and admitted that he hadn't anticipated the swift return of the icicle to his possession. Inquiring of Choi Siwoo, Goyu questioned whether he had underestimated him too quickly and whether they had already progressed beyond the initial phase of their encounter right from the beginning. Choi Siwoo directed a question at Goyu, seeking clarity beyond mere words. He inquired whether Goyu's intentions truly were an attempt to consume or devour him. Expressing his observations, Choi Siwoo conveyed to Goyu that he didn't detect any imminent threat or malevolent intent emanating from him. Goyu responded by sharing his perspective with Choi Siwoo. He explained that attempting to forcefully create a persona that doesn't truly exist felt awkward to him. He further clarified that he didn't harbor grudges or specific appetites, and emphasized that Choi Siwoo's previous statements had managed to irritate him. Goyu inquired if Choi Siwoo truly comprehended the essence of being a yokai. Choi Siwoo affirmed that he indeed had an understanding of it. Goyu prompted Choi Siwoo to engage in careful consideration and reflection. He encouraged Choi Siwoo to contemplate whether it seemed somewhat unusual to select a ruler who would hold dominion for centuries based solely on a single specific ritual. Despite Goyu's explanation about the tradition of the yokai world, Choi Siwoo remained cautious and maintained a defensive posture, unwilling to let his guard down. Goyu explained to Choi Siwoo that the beings within their world were inherently loyal to their desires and instincts. He clarified that even though the powerful might establish laws and rules, it didn't necessarily mean that these creatures would abide to them, and normally slaughter and predation wouldn't cease. As a preventative measure, the creation of the Yokai King was attributed to ancient yokai, serving as a safeguard against potential chaos and violence. Recognizing the inherent nature of yokai and the potential for inevitable catastrophe, there was a unanimous vote among them to safeguard against such events. This agreement was encapsulated in the shared sentiment of "let's protect this to ensure the preservation of their realm." The figure that holds authority over the obedience of all yokai within their realm, maintaining harmony for their survival, is known as the Yokai King. Continuing the conversation, Goyu conveyed to Choi Siwoo that, fortunately, the succession of yokai kings had effectively managed the yokai of their respective eras for more than a millennium. While there might have been occasional differences and disagreements, the core principle governing the survival and well-being of the yokai remained constant. Expanding on his point, Goyu added that there was an exception among the line of yokai kings, the current yokai king of their generation. Goyu tells Choi Siwoo to imagine if your human leaders suddenly introduced a law as drastic as this one day: no one in the world should ever eat meat, no matter what happens. What chaos would occur? Choi Siwoo contemplated the scenario and expressed his belief that such a law would likely provoke widespread protests, and the situation might escalate beyond mere protest. In response, Goyu informed him that the Yokai King had already upheld a similar law for an impressive span of 666 years. Goyu conveyed to Choi Siwoo that contemplating the situation could provide them with a rough understanding of just how crucial the Yokai King was to their realm. He emphasized the significance of the tradition and the considerable efforts that had been endured to maintain it over time. Goyu further explained that it appeared that even the yokai's patience had reached its limit, and he inquired whether Choi Siwoo understood the implication behind his words. Choi Siwoo pondered the situation, considering that if the next Yokai King were to enact the same law, not everyone would obediently adhere to it as they had in the past. Goyu commended Choi Siwoo for grasping the concept swiftly and acknowledged that even if it were a command from the king, the yokai wouldn't necessarily obey it at all times. If many yokai decide not to follow the Yokai King's rules, even though the king is very strong, they can still cause a lot of trouble and not listen to what the king says. Goyu explained that the consequences wouldn't only affect the new Yokai King, the entire system that has been maintained for a long time, including the authority and significance of the Yokai King, would collapse. Goyu carefully considered and grasped the meaning behind Choi Siwoo's words, coming to an understanding of the perspective he had presented. Goyu conveyed to Choi Siwoo that while some yokai might brush off his bold statements, the younger ones perhaps even making fun of him and moving on, the older yokai could react more aggressively, potentially trying to confront him and challenge his claims. Having pieced together the puzzle of Choi Siwoo's behavior, Goyu came to the realization that Choi Siwoo didn't conform to the traditional image of a yokai, and his issue was more about his lack of understanding of the world's ways. He recognized that Choi Siwoo's tendency to openly display his affection without considering the consequences might be the root of his problem. Choi Siwoo then asked Goyu if he was asking him to take back the words he had said earlier. Openly sharing his observations, Goyu admitted that he initially perceived Choi Siwoo as someone he could easily defeat, but upon closer examination, He acknowledged that Choi Siwoo had shown significant growth and potential for further development. Expressing a proposition, Goyu suggested to Choi Siwoo that if he joined his side and allowed him to become the Yokai King, he would grant Choi Siwoo the authority to rule over the Korean peninsula. Goyu thinks that Choi Siwoo acknowledged that the proposal was indeed alluring, acknowledging that even if Goyu were to rule, eradicating humans completely wouldn't be feasible. However, he mentioned that he could potentially spare a select few humans who were close to him. Goyu was caught off guard by Choi Siwoo's sudden question about whether he believed his chances of becoming the Yokai King were high. Choi Siwoo hesitated for a moment, while Goyu confidently responded that there was no one in the Yokai world stronger than him. In the midst of their conversation about whether Choi Siwoo would join him, Choi Siwoo had reached a decision. Choi Siwoo's sudden action of reaching out his hand seemed to indicate his decision to join Goyu's side. Taken aback by Choi Siwoo's rapid decision, Goyu was caught off guard yet pleased as he acknowledged that Choi Siwoo would indeed accept his proposal, particularly if it translated to safeguarding the people around him. Grasping Choi Siwoo's hand with a sense of satisfaction, Goyu expressed his approval of the choice Choi Siwoo had made. However, Choi Siwoo emulated a powerful aura and confidently conveyed to Goyu that he considered it a smart decision to join hands, emphasizing that he wouldn't feel any guilt about what he was about to do. As Choi Siwoo held onto Goyu's hand with a strong grip, an unexpected and intense surge of electric power surged through his own hand, creating a sensation that he had never experienced before and making him aware of the unique energy that flowed between them. Goyu found himself taken aback by the sudden and potent surge of power that Choi Siwoo seemed to be emanating through their handshake. The intensity of the energy flowing between them was unexpected and left Goyu surprised. Choi Siwoo copied what Goyu did before by shaking his hand, making it seem innocent. But deep down, he had a sneaky plan all along. The current situation marked a significant departure from the wrestling tactics Siwoo had employed earlier. He was employing just 60% of his available energy, deliberately reserving a small portion, and then exerting himself to fully utilize what he had conserved, effectively squeezing out every possible bit of his stored power. The energy surge within Choi Siwoo intensified, radiating a powerful aura. In a pivotal moment, driven by his unyielding determination, Choi Siwoo harnessed a technique he had never used before, channeling his energy into a powerful surge that radiated from within him. With an unprecedented surge of energy, Choi Siwoo seized the opportunity, swiftly bringing Goyu to the ground in a wrestle. Fueled by a surge of anger, Choi Siwoo's actions were characterized by determination and unwavering readiness, leaving no room for hesitation. Choi Siwoo's anger ignited a formidable burst of power as he engaged in a fierce confrontation against Goyu.
Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel for more content like this. Leave a comment for the next part, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.